And do you have any, you mentioned that there was a higher percentage in the female rats. Is there any speculation as to why that occurred, why there's a sex difference?
Yes, there was about a 3-to-1 rate of tumors in the females, and that coincides with what Dr. Roberts discusses in his book, Aspartame Epidemic. Do you remember the name of that book? I know you mentioned that in your book.
I forget, but if you just type in H.J. Roberts on Amazon and aspartame, you'll come up with it. It's probably the most definitive resource on the topic. I mean, he's did an exhaustive review and compilation.
Mm-hmm. Also, the FDA had a much higher percentage, about 3-to-1, females reporting adverse effects compared to males. My personal theory is that aspartame is probably estrogenic, or it's a xenoestrogen, which acts like estrogen in the body. I don't understand why else that would affect especially a lot of them appeared to be mammary gland tumors. Mm-hmm. And in a book on rats, I read that if they removed I believe if they removed the uterus, or they were able to reduce the amount of tumors in the rats by removing female organs. I don't remember specifically which ones they removed at this point.
Well, let's just interject here at one point to just review the biochemistry for those who are not familiar with aspartame. But it's a relatively simple biochemical and promoted initially, and I still don't know if they try to get away with this, but promoted as being natural because essentially it's a conjugation or a combination of two natural amino acids which occur in all the proteins, which is phenylalanine and aspartic acid. The problem is that it's linked in an ester bond, and this is unnatural, which makes it completely synthetic. And when it's consumed, it's rapidly broken down to three products, which is really formaldehyde, aspartic acid, and the phenylalanine. And the problems with amino acids is that they're in such high concentrations that it really disturbs these very sensitive ratios that can cause loads of other issues. But one of the most significant ones is this formaldehyde, which readily passes the blood-brain barrier and is rapidly converted to methanol, which is root alcohol, and is a really significantly toxic poison. And and then it has its own complications, and there's some significant research that suggests it may even lead to MS. But the reason I mention that is it just doesn't seem that any of those three elements would be linked to sex hormones unless they triggered some type of other biochemical function or reaction in the body.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. There was a water quality expert on PBS about 10 years ago, and he was saying that there are something like 2,000 chemicals in our water supply that are xenoestrogens,
mm-hmm. Sure.
like estrogens in the body. And I'm wondering if maybe...
So that's the other variable. You were giving them tap water.
No, I was giving them well water.
Well water? From your home? Okay. And if you had your well tested for any chemicals?
Well, my brother lives across the street, and he had his well tested, and we're getting water from the same underground source. And he said they found no toxic.
It's unusual where they are, but there's no way to know unless you look. Still, that would make sense if it was a traditional municipal water supply.
Yeah. Well, I thought that was one of the reasons possibly my control rats were healthier than normal controls, because someone mentioned that on one of the blogs that my control rats were too healthy, although I didn't think that they were myself. But
and their food sources were pretty comparable?
Well, since I performed the experiment, I've noticed that some labs use actually special foods for their animals, which I...
Purina rat chow.
Yeah. Well, I did use conventional rat chow that I bought from the local feed store, which isn't that healthy, in my opinion. But at the time, I didn't know that. But one thing I wanted to mention that you were talking about phenylalanine and aspartic acid is that I believe there's a high chance that they're not natural amino acids in the case of aspartame, but they're actually produced synthetically using genetically modified E. coli, which can introduce toxic byproducts and which I would prefer to avoid.
Well, I think most of us would, unless you're part of Monsanto's cadre of experts and professionals. But that is interesting. I think I do remember that. That was that they were produced by genetically modified organisms. So that puts a whole different bent in it. And so there may be contaminants in the actual NutraSweet product that are really not identified.
Right. And the reason is that it produces a very high yield. And it's all about money.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. Yeah. But part of it does produce a high yield, but this is such a potent sweetener that it's needed at relatively small concentrations. I mean, it's 500-600 times sweeter than sugar. So you're really looking at milligram amounts for the most part.
Yeah.
Well, and even if it's 10% contaminated, it's 1/10 of a milligram. So, but it depends on how potent these contaminants are, I guess.
Well, they have found E. coli in a number of water supplies and sodas throughout the country. There's a study done, and it's hard to say what the source was. Not in the water supply, but in the sodas.
Well, E. coli by itself is not significant concern unless it's really a toxic strain or it's in very large quantities, because most people are not going to have a problem with it. But the synthetics or really these artificial toxins that are really not normally found in nature would be of a more serious concern.
And another thing is you were talking about the effects of the different breakdown components of aspartame. And one of the things is that Dr. Blaylock discusses is the holes in the brain that it can cause over time, and that they're comparable to those found in Alzheimer's patients, Parkinson's patients, and Lou Gehrig's patients. And there's a Alzheimer's epidemic now, and that could be possibly one of the causes.
So is this from the diketopepersone?
No, the aspartic acid.
Okay.
And then the phenylalanine, as you mentioned, causes an imbalance in the brain, which can cause aggressive behavior, violent behavior, suicidal thoughts, depression, and lead to an addiction to aspartame. So, and then of course you mentioned the methyl ester, and that breaks down into methanol, it breaks down to formaldehyde and then formic acid.
Yeah, actually, I had that reverse. It breaks down to methanol first, and then it's converted to formaldehyde. So and the interesting component of that, if you say you worked in an anatomy lab and you had relatively large exposures to formaldehyde, even though that's toxic, it's not as bad as this methanol, because once the methanol actually bypasses the blood-brain barrier, and once it's in there, it turns to formaldehyde, which is where most of the damage occurs.
Right, and formaldehyde is accumulative. And one thing about the aspartame industry claims that methanol is safe in the body, that's naturally occurring in fruits and vegetables. And that is true. For example, in tomatoes and oranges, there is a certain amount of methanol, but it also has the antidote ethanol that comes naturally occurring with it, which prevents the methanol from breaking down because the ethanol is processed first and allows the methanol to be excreted through the skin, the kidneys. So
I think that's true for wine, but for the fruits and vegetables, my understanding is that the methanol is bound up in pectin or some other fibers. And
really?
As a result of that, it's relatively unavailable for absorption.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, but the problem is that that's in its raw state. Once you process it and you put it in a glass jar or plastic and it's dissociated from its natural state, then the longer it's in that, the more of this dissociation that occurs, and the higher the rate of methanol, which is why most tomato products are relatively high in this methanol. But once you cook them, like in a tomato sauce that you're cooking, then it volatilizes, so it's not an issue. But if you're taking a juice or canned fruit or something, it can be a real significant issue. But the issue with, as you mentioned, with the ethanol is really for the alcoholic fermented beverages, where in fact the ethanol is preferentially metabolized and then the methanol is not, and then it's excreted in the urine or through the sweat, or you breathe it out. So because actually, if you go into the emergency room with methanol poisoning, one of the treatments is IV ethanol.
That's right. And the point is that aspartame doesn't have any ethanol in it, so you're just getting the methanol without the antidote.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed any negative effects on you personally or from any family members from aspartame?
Well, when I did the experiment, and actually up until just a few years ago, I hadn't thought of myself personally, but then a friend was asking about it, or somehow came up in a conversation, and then I have actually become aware that I have personally experienced negative effects. I consumed high amounts of diet sodas for many years, and I ate quite a bit of vegetarian meats, which are high in MSG, for a number of years. And I ended up gaining over 100 pounds. And my doctor diagnosed me a couple years ago with metabolic syndrome, which is high fat content around the waist and organs, and diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol. And Dr. Blaylock has discussed both of those issues in terms of being results from aspartame and MSG.
Yeah, that's one of the compelling reasons that most people choose diet or sodas or artificial sweeteners in general, is that it has less calories and sugar. So the obvious assumption is that because of that, you're going to be less likely to gain weight, when the exact opposite appears to be the case from the studies that have been performed and from the people like yourself who undergo this experiment. They actually gain more weight than if they had consumed the regular sugar, because it's not really a calorie component. It has to do with more insulin and leptin resistance and cravings and creating these dependencies that gets into a vicious cycle that essentially makes the weight loss or the weight gain even worse.
It also destroys the part of the brain that processes leptin, so that and leptin controls the appetite and the fat accumulation, so that mechanism no longer works in the body.
No, I wasn't aware of that, but it's not a surprise. So it impairs the leptin's optimization, which is, I would imagine, that someone hearing that who's currently taking diet sodas or has a large amount of artificial sweeteners would be somewhat discouraged from stopping. But the point I'd like to make is that the body's pretty resilient and has an intrinsic capacity to self-repair and heal. So even though there's damage that occurs there, it's unusual where the body can't repair that. So,
I totally agree with you with the body self-repairing. I'm not sure if the brain has the capability to do that in terms of having researched it, but I have a very strong faith myself in the body being able to heal itself, providing you have the right nutrients and you're
sure.
eating toxins.
Yeah, you don't mess it up in some other way, which is very challenging to do, but nevertheless possible.